The paper was about chemistry, so I couldn't understand it. So I asked him, does it contribute anything to your field? And he said, yes. And I asked him then, did you tell in your paper what it contributes? And he said, no. And the conclusion is a very good space for telling people what research is important. There are about a few of them in this video. Now, I start, and this is my conclusion, and I should conclude one sentence summary. You'll see we'll spend the entire conclusion summarizing, but I sort of think because you found, or what you did, is more there for you to explore aspects. There's no some paragraph. Sometimes it's many paragraphs, and sometimes it's marked as conclusion, and sometimes it's simply the end of the paper. And as you go through the discussion paper, you're becoming more and more. So that's the conclusion, subjective side of your paper. The purpose of this research was to illustrate the decision, and so that simply summarizes is where I try to get to the conclusion of my paper to the field, making the appropriate choices regarding repurpose, the creation of an appropriate has frequently been ignored in the teaching. Now, I have not said this has been ignored in there. It's a pet peeve with a lot of research on reporting books. I just don't like the way it's dealt with. The third paragraph is interesting. It's also something you need to think about ahead of time, which is what are the limitations of your... This is in a formal research. Even in an argumentative paper, you might sometimes want to see the points, show that the people they made a couple of points, but here limitations to this approach as well. And I go on in the rest of the paragraph to talk about the limitations. I've always, you recognize your own limits. It's difficult for other people as you for patients. So one thing I said, for example, the analysis is preliminary is a word writers often use to say, don't take this too seriously, it needs a lot more work, and some further revision. And that's another thing you often see in conclusions is what we're going to do next step in the research. And if we did this step, it's useful to put in that, this would look at samples of it and see if it corroborates what I found. But again, it's important for laying future research, another strategy. But I come back to, I don't want to say myself too much, nevertheless, by making some choices, it was hoped that students could deeper understanding. And that's, again, going back to contribution. Now I want to skip down. I write very long conclusions. In my field, that's acceptable. In other fields, the conclusion might only be a paragraph. So you have to know that about your field before you decide how long the conclusion is. But if you notice the beginning of this paragraph, this is the second from the end, there are larger issues regarding the use of technology in second language composition. Now, this pushes it a little bit into another area that I have interest in and that I've published in, but it doesn't, the paper itself did never directly address the issues of technology in second language composition. There's a connection to that. I use the technology, but that wasn't the central focus in the paper. But I think it's an important issue that's related to it, so I explore it a little bit as well. And then again, in the final paragraph, language use is a process of negotiation. And so that's a very general statement about the use of language, which, as Hopper argues, can be well shown not by using isolated, decontextualized sentences, but by providing students with authentic examples of uses and of the processes by which writers make decisions about the expression of these important lexical ideas. So I'm evaluating, I conclude the conclusion by evaluating how important this research is. I cite a well-known linguist who happened to be my advisor to support that claim, even though he didn't do any research related to this particular item. I show it's consistent with his argument, but the general purpose here is to show this research makes an important contribution to the field. So in this discussion, we're going to look at journals, and I'm going to focus on one that I'm familiar with, which is the Journal of Second Language Writing. I've published a number of articles, and I'm currently on the editorial board. So if you look at some of the aspects of the journal, it tells you, and we'll look through this, the editors, C.M. Tardy and G. Gentile. And remember, in the era when we were getting so many fake journals, that it's very important to look at who the editors are and if they're familiar to me. So particularly Chris Tardy has published a number of articles and a book. So I would feel very comfortable publishing in a journal that she edits. Now, if we look down a little more, over here on the left, you see the journal metrics. And the metrics are a number of calculated numbers that are used, they traditionally were used in libraries, but now they're used in a number of areas to judge the importance of the journal. So the most important one is the impact factor. And the impact factor, as it says, measures the average number of citations received in a particular year by papers published. And again, this is a number you can compare in your discipline. It doesn't make much sense across disciplines. The 5-year impact factor, which is a little higher, shows that over a longer period of time than that the journal has, this is the number. Those are fairly good numbers. These are another number. It uses a somewhat different algorithm. So there are a number of issues, a number of numbers, and then what you would do is compare this number to the numbers of other journals. It takes a number of years for a journal to get an impact factor. So if it's a brand new journal, it won't have one. And that raises a red flag, although many journals are new journals and don't have them. You can also look very briefly here at the most downloaded articles. And this at least tells you a little bit about what is popular in the field. So the first article is about giving teacher feedback on papers. The next article is also about feedback on papers. And the third article is about genre. You can kind of get a sense of who's publishing in these journals. At least the first and third articles are fairly well known. And again, you can get a sense of the topics. At least you know if you're writing a paper on corrective feedback or on genre, this would be a fairly good place to go. You can also look at the most cited articles over here. That also gives you a little sense. The first article is about peer review. The second article is about computational assessment of language differences. Now, that's a little different topic, so that broadens it up a lot. And here's an article on English or Chinese about publication for Chinese academics. So that's a more theoretical article. So it gives you a little overview of the types of articles. Finally, down here you see the most recent articles, and it has to do with some kind of debate over whether there are cultural differences between different languages in terms of your rhetoric. These are special issues. Special issues refer to this journal particularly has issues, and they're all on one topic. They have guest editors. They're chosen by the editorial board. And they're often sometimes on a little different topics. So by making it a special issue, you can focus your topic a little more. So this is a good opportunity for a special issue if you happen to be looking at it. Now these are the old ones, so it would be too late, but you would kind of keep your eye on what special issues are available. Now I want to look at the guidelines, and again, remember, everyone should have a copy of the guidelines. Some of them we've talked about in tutorial this week are more specific than other ones. This one, again, this journal is published by a large publishing firm, Elsevier, so they tend to have very specific. It gives you a description of the journal. What are the topics that they normally look at? Some areas of interest are the characteristics of L2 writers, L2 composing, features of L2 text, readers and responses, assessment, and a variety of different topics. Now, it doesn't tell you specifically what this is about. This is where you have to read the journal. For example, most of the articles in this journal are geared toward college level writers. So you could be doing L2 writers in elementary school or high school. This may or may not be the right journal for that kind of publication. Next, it presents the editorial board. So again, they're the editors. The book review editor is very well known. The statistics editor is very well known. And then if you look down on the editorial board, of course, some people are not as famous as others, but you can kind of see, if you're in the field, you would know that these people are pretty well known. Now, sometimes that's deceptive because sometimes people's names are just put on there. But this has a large number of well-known people in the field. So again, you can feel very confident about this. And as we go down, it presents a more detailed description of the journal, what it's looking for. So it talks about theoretically grounded reports of research and discussion of central issues. So that gives you a sense that it's not simply a reporting data, but some kind of larger theory that you want to develop about these topics. It tells you how often it's published. And again, it does not necessarily tell you the specifics of the kinds of articles. That, again, you have to get from the reading the journal. Again, gives you details, as in many journals. It has a platform where you submit your articles through if you want to have them published, and that you have to follow specific procedures. And again, It's very important that you follow these procedures. Remember, if you don't follow, editors might be a little suspicious about how dedicated you are, and they'll kind of reject your topic. There's an ethics consideration. This has become very critical because there are so many ethical issues. Journals are worried about conflicts of interest. Um, Now, again, these are the kinds of things that you may need to uh, detail to the editor in a letter, a separate cover letter that you would send with them. Now, I mean, in my field, there aren't too many conflicts of interest. You may be working for a publisher, in which case you wouldn't be necessarily allowed to review a book that that publisher had published, or a textbook, or maybe a friend. I always sort of, my students, for example, really cannot review my book. That would indicate a certain conflict of interest. Here at the bottom, one of the concerns is informed consent. That refers to whether, if you're looking at subjects, even papers, student papers, which I do a lot, that you should be able to have you should have gotten permission for them. Sometimes this journal will ask you, do you have permission? In some cases, although not here, they'll actually ask you for the permission forms. So, and we've seen in other journals, this can be very detailed. There's a concern with animals. If you're in an area where you are dealing with animals, though, they may ask you how you took care of the animals. Fortunately, animals can't write, so I don't have to worry about animals, but I do have to worry about students. And this is actually very sensitive if I were doing research on younger students, high school and elementary school, because they need more protection, and they need their parents' consent. One of the other big concerns, of course, is what's called pre-publication. And pre-publication can be very complicated because there's no one definition of it. Generally speaking, as we've discussed, you cannot submit the same paper to two different journals. But the question is, what does submission mean? Does it mean is the paper on a website? Does it mean that it was published in a proceedings, given at a conference? Journals just vary a great deal. This journal, I don't think, is really primarily focused with publication elsewhere. But other journals might have a much more narrow definition, or a much more expanded definition of what pre-publication meant. The other question is to make sure, if you have multiple authors, that all of the authors are on board. There's been a number of scandals that have to do with falsifying data and plagiarism, where one author may have violated an ethical precept, and then all the authors get blamed. So that you have to declare that you know that all the authors have been informed, and that they're aware and will accept responsibility. You can publish the article in any other language. They won't accept translations or violation of copyright. Later, if you want to change authors, you want to add an author or remove an author, you have to let the journal know. We'll talk later in the course about copyright and intellectual property. It's very complicated. You need to submit, normally you need to submit a form once you after you've been accepted, that gives the publisher a wide variety of rights. Sometimes you have to give them all the rights to your paper, and you can't even share it. Sometimes that you give them some rights and you retain some rights. Again, this is very complicated. I've been told that sometimes this is negotiable if you're upset about giving over your rights, but that's kind of up to you. Most people are just happy that they got published, and are willing to give up their rights. And this also assumes you have the rights. So those of you, if you're working with advisors, there can be a conflict. Maybe your advisor doesn't want you to publish the article in a particular journal. So, and there are a number of conflicts, particularly you're working with an advisor and then maybe you get a job somewhere else. Who retains the rights to the research? So this can be a very sticky issue, and it gets more complicated if you happen to be working in areas where there's lots of money, either where your research has been funded by a company or where your research may lead toward lots of money, those issues of rights. A lot of the major publishing houses are giving you the option of open access, that is allowing your articles to be read by anyone. Unfortunately, most of them charge a tremendous amount of money for allowing this to happen. I don't know how often somebody pays it, but it could be over $1,000. So very few people are going to pay for this. So if you're interested in open access, you should find a journal that actually is open access and not one published by a large corporation. Another concern that you'll often see is the kind of language that is acceptable. We've seen different journals. Some journals don't seem to care. We've looked at IEEE transaction, which actually said, don't worry about it. We'll fix your English if you have trouble. Other journals will not fix your English. They expect you to pay sometimes $300–400 to a service, and that does not guarantee you any publication. That just means before you submit the article, they want you to have it cleaned up by this service, and then you just pay up front and take your chances with being published. It goes on down here to talk a little bit about the review policy. It asks you, it's a double-blind review. It says, please remove all identifying features from the paper, ensuring that the author's name doesn't appear in the text or in the citations, reference lists. Now, sometimes authors, I just read a paper just a couple of days ago where the author took her name off the paper but left the title of the article and the journal in the reference list. So all I had to do was Google it, and I found out the name of the authors. That was a big, I've never seen that happen before. But it's happened a couple of times. I did find another one because there was a article referring to a YouTube video, and all I had to do was Google the video, and I found out at least one of the authors. So those are kinds of slip-ups. I don't know how they affect things. I sent an email to the editor of the journal about the first case. And I'll be curious to see if the editor will respond to that. Down here, it gives you the kinds of articles they publish. So remember, you have choices. Sometimes, some of you might have not a short report. Maybe it's not a full-length article yet, something you just did, and you may be able to get that published. Again, they don't count as much, but particularly I feel as graduate students, you're trying to just show that you're interested in publication, that you understand the process, and that may help you when it comes to the job market. But of course, it's better if you have a full-length article. There are other types of articles besides the full-length article, of course, and there are also book reviews. Most journals have book reviews. These are often assigned. Most journals don't allow you to just submit a book review. They usually ask you. Sometimes your advisor may receive a book, and normally book reviews count very little, so very few faculty really want to do them, so they give them to their grad students. It's a good chance. You get a free book. Um, and it shows that you're interested in the publishing process and that you get your name in the journal. Preparation of papers. This journal uses a service um, so that you have to submit the paper either as a PDF or a Word file. Other journals might ask you for different formats. One of the interesting things here about this journal is the references. They don't have a specific format. Many journals say you must use a certain style, APA style, Chicago style. All here they're asking you for is to be consistent. And that could be important. One of the difficulties in my field is some of the styles are very different. So if you have to switch journals or submit it to a different journal after you get rejected, you have to really spend a lot of time rewriting the reference. So in this case, you can at least keep one format. So if you already have the references, you don't have to change it. They advise you to use spell check and the grammar check functions. It tends to look a little sloppy. They also give you a article structure. Now, again, in the tutorial, one of the reasons I asked you to bring in samples of articles so that we can look at the structure. They have a very specific, and again, this is very important to follow. You need these terms: introduction, materials and methods, results, discussion, and conclusion. And again, so every paper has a sort of standard form. You just need to sort of adapt your paper to that. The paper almost every journal wants an abstract. Here it's 200 words, it may be 150 words. It tells you what should be in the abstract. Abstracts are usually maybe 1 or 2 sentences from each of the major sections of the paper. They do ask you often as a reviewer whether the abstract really captured the paper. I'm never sure what happens if you say no, but people do sometimes criticize papers if the abstract doesn't capture the paper. A graphical abstract, optional. Some of them ask for highlights, so they're mandatory, so a few interesting things, and also a section of keywords, 6 keywords that they can use to identify them. An acknowledgement, could be an interesting category. You usually must acknowledge your funding sources, but that's also a good thing for you. You usually add this after you've been accepted because the acknowledgments could give away where where the research takes place and even who you are. But again, this is a chance to acknowledge your friends, the funding, but particularly, maybe your advisor if they're not on the paper, or well-known people who have read the paper. If you've asked anyone to read it and they're well-known, that tells the reader, not so much the editor, but the reader, that this might be a very interesting work if you have interesting friends. There's an interesting article about that. Sometimes they thank the reviewers. You never know the reviewer's name, so it says thank anonymous reviewers. I rarely do that, but a lot of people like to just thank everyone. Once you get the paper accepted, they usually post the paper nowadays, particularly large journals. Before it comes out, they give it a DOI, digital object identifier. I don't usually use these. Other people use them maybe to cite papers. You get a set of proofs, which are PDF files.
will be sent to the author that's designated as the corresponding author. It's the responsibility of the author to proofread these papers. There could be mistakes. It could be your last chance to correct any errors, but also there could be mistakes in the editorial process or changes that you don't like. You're not supposed to change anything major. These are really for grammatical errors, punctuation errors, spelling errors, like that. And you're really not supposed to make any major changes to the paper at this point. Finally, once the paper is published, in the old days, particularly they used to give you 25 copies of it. You could send it to your friends, your family, people who asked about it. Again, if you've signed over your rights, legally you may not be able to send people the PDF file. That's a kind of tricky issue. We'll talk about that later. So they give you off prints. Here, because it's a corporation, they give you a link so you can get more prints. They even give you a discount. Down at the bottom, you can inquire if there's a problem with your paper. It usually doesn't help, and then once they send it out to the reviewers, it's really up to the reviewers to get it back. And if the reviewers are late, then that's not much the editor can do. So there's not much to complain that, oh, I really need this. There's really not much, and it makes you sound a little wonky. But they do give you here a link down here so you can track your paper and you can track your article. This contact customer support, it doesn't say contact the editor. So once you're in the process, you probably will have minimal contact with the editor. So in the next discussion, we're going to look more at the interchange between what the reviewers say and how you respond to review.